Hello, world at large. Happy Tuesday, Tuesday breakdown. Time for my caffeine libations. Coming to you live, if you're watching this right now with me. Coming to you pre-recorded live, which is always an interesting way that TV used to say live, pre-recorded, on tape. I don't know. Anyway, if you're watching this later, thank you. If you're watching this now, thank you. Today, we're going to talk about all things Joseph, the Sunday service from last week. Also, have time available if you'd like to talk about any theological concepts or questions about anything. Feel free to chime in on the chat if you're watching live and help us decide what we're going to talk about. But most of you, I think, are going to watch this later, so you can't request unless you have a DeLorean and can go back in time. Which, if you do, why haven't we met yet? Come visit me. Today we're going to talk about what went into the sermon last Sunday. Joseph wept. This was actually one that came together better than I thought it might, as I kind of reveal here in these director's commentaries how the sermon writing went. This chapter is 42 through 45. Tell the story of the reuniting of Joseph with his brothers and the multiple trips the brothers take and the multiple tricks Joseph puts on his brothers, from putting the money back in their grain sacks to the silver chalice in Benjamin's sack. Anyway, it's 4 chapters, 42, 43, 44, 45, all telling this very long story that gets kind of confusing, and it plays out over a number of months in their lives. And as I was preparing the Joseph series, I thought, well, obviously, the climax of the story is the family reunion. But how do you put that in a sermon when it's 4 chapters of text? Does each chapter get its own sermon? That felt weird because they're not natural chapter breaks in the story, even though they're chapters in our Bible. The story itself, those chapters weren't there when Moses wrote it. Those were added later by transcriptionists of the Bible. So do you tell the whole story 4 weeks in a row, 3 weeks in a row? How do you do this? How do you break it up? And I really had a lot of time to think about this. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this because I kind of felt like the initial visit of the 10 brothers without Benjamin needed to be its own week. And then the second visit with Benjamin needs to be its own week. But then there's also Jacob comes. They go back and get Jacob, and all of the kids and grandkids and everybody in the family tribe comes down. We haven't gotten there yet. How many sermons are there, and what is the point of each sermon? If it's just the story of the reunification, reunions, well, that's one story. If it's the brothers processing what's going on, but then also Benjamin being there, that's 2. I researched in the commentaries. I looked all over at how other pastors have preached this series, or even like Sunday school materials, because this is the story of Joseph is pretty common in children's Sunday school materials. So I looked into that. I'm not sure what I did was necessarily the right way or the smart way, but here's what I opted for. I'm going to tell the story in the 2 visits of the brothers. So the first visit, which is all in chapter 42, is its own sermon. And then I'm going to tell the second visit with all the Benjamin stuff mixed in there, which is 43, 44, 45, as one sermon, because their narratives are somewhat complete in that. But what I decided to do was, one of them I'm going to do from the brothers' perspective, and one of them I'm going to do from Joseph's perspective. And that's what I tried to do. So last week, the sermon was the brothers' bow. And it was kind of the unfinished business. They have the unconfessed guilt. And really, again, getting back to God knows what he's doing. He's got an unstoppable plan. So that was the brothers bowing is kind of the first thing, but it's an incomplete story. So that's why it's really a 2-parter. It was always meant to be a 2-parter. And the second part was this last Sunday, which was from Joseph's perspective. And then I thought, well, what's the through line here? Because Joseph doesn't really go anywhere. He's hanging out in Egypt at his palace. He's got Simeon now in prison. He's just waiting. Maybe Benjamin is still alive and they'll bring him. Maybe he's not. Maybe he is and they won't bring him. What about Jacob? And so Joseph's just kind of waiting, playing the waiting game. And then when they come back with Benjamin, he has these things. So I thought, what's the through line from Joseph in this story? And the through line is, again, this might not be the right way to do it, but it's the way I chose to do it, is the 3 times he weeps in this narrative. And why? Why is he weeping when he overhears his brothers confessing their guilt? Why is he weeping when he sees Benjamin for the first time? Why is he weeping when he finally reveals himself in chapter 45? And so I thought that's a good through line. It can get to the bottom of what Joseph's experience is through all this, and certainly reveals for us the challenges of forgiveness, reconciliation, because Joseph he's a normal human just like us. And even though the text never really gets us inside his head, except when it says he felt compassion for Benjamin in that second weeping, it doesn't ever really tell us, is he tricking them? What is his game here? We don't really know. We have to speculate. However, I think the speculation makes sense if you take the entire story together, that he is still concerned about certain things, which is normal human behavior because we would be as well. Can I really trust them? Are they really sorry? Is my brother still alive? And I think I tried as I preached, whenever there was speculation, to say, I think, which is, again, the kind of the point of these breakdowns is to give you what goes on inside of a preacher's mind, or my mind anyway. And one of the dangers, 2 of the dangers of preaching narrative passages, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament. The book of Acts has a bunch of narrative passages. Narrative versus the more didactic teaching passages. Like if you're going to read 1 Timothy, there's a lot of do this, don't do this, think this way, don't think this way. If you read Romans, there's a lot of theology as well as that. Here's what we should do now. So more instructional passages, whereas narrative is, this happened to someone at some point in history and they did this and they didn't do this. And the 2 dangers when you're preaching a narrative passage or studying it is, number one, the danger is to tell the story that the text doesn't tell us. Okay, if God wanted us to know these other details of the story, he would have put it in the text. What we have is the text is the authority from God, not the story behind the text. Okay, for example, Noah's friends, as he's building the ark, they laughed at him, right? Of course they did. Everybody knows that, because whenever you tell the story of Noah and the ark, you talk about how all the other people laughed at him because for whatever reason, what he's doing seemed weird. And so if you're doing something for the Lord and your friends or family don't get it and they make fun of you, you should see it through just like Noah. That's a great sermon. None of that's in the text. Noah's friends laughing at him is nowhere in the text. But it gets fleshed out that way. And then the preaching point comes from the backstory that's not there. And that's an error. That's a mistake. And I've been culpable of it many times myself, which is I get into the story and I think, well, if I were that character, I'd be thinking this. And so therefore I assume they were thinking that. And a lot of times I'm trying to make the story, appealing or interesting as I retell it. And so I do that, like I did a couple weeks, both weeks in a row now, I did the brothers huddle. All right, let's huddle up. And then Issachar, you're doing this, and Zebulun, you go long, and like that. I do that for the fun of retelling the story, but obviously that's not in the text. Although they do huddle, and they don't think Joseph can understand them. But what they say is what they say in the text, and so that's the preaching point. That's always the preaching point. The text. If I make it fun or flesh it out, or if any preacher does, that's okay. Just that can't be the point of the sermon. And whenever I do that, I try to make it obvious that I'm paraphrasing or I'm having fun with it, or I think maybe this is kind of what went down, but that's not the point. The point is what's in the text. Okay, so that's one mistake that is common when preaching a narrative, is to get behind the story in a way that we oughtn't to do. Another example of that, I worked in a Christian bookstore, and I got a chance to meet some Christian authors over the years. And one of them came right out and told me, it's an author, you might have heard her name before, but she just came right out and told me that the best-selling books are when you take a Bible story and you turn the camera a little bit. So you tell the birth narrative of Jesus from the donkey's point of view. And those books sell like hotcakes. Maybe from a storytelling perspective, that can be fun. That is a terrible way to preach, because it says that what God told us in his text isn't enough. So I really try to avoid that. The text drives the point. The story can get fleshed out for fun or for, I think maybe this is what happened, but I have to be really careful when I preach that I'm not drawing a point from something that's not there in the text. Second possible big error that can be made in narrative preaching. I talked a little bit about this last week in the update breakdown, is moralization, which is what's the moral of the story, and therefore that's the preaching point, instead of what does the text say. For example, the most common bad narrative preaching example of this is the David and Goliath story, which is, who's the Goliath in your life? Maybe your Goliath is a conflict at work, and it takes the story of David and Goliath, which is an actual historical narrative that's in our text, and it makes everything a metaphor for some more moral story in your life, like an Aesop's fable. And this happens all the time. In fact, my first preaching class in seminary, we were all given the assignment to write an outline for Mark 4, which is the storm at sea. Jesus crossing the Sea of Galilee with the disciples, the storm at sea. He calms the sea, they get to the other side. Virtually everyone in that class, their outline was, what are the storms you're facing in your life that you need to trust Jesus will manage for you so that you too can get to the other side of the storms in your life? That's what all these, entry-level preachers put down in their outlines. And I'll never forget, the professor got up and he basically said, you're all wrong. You're all committing one of the major mistakes of exegetical preaching. So the point of the story is not what is the storm in your life. The point of the story is there was an actual storm with these actual people that Jesus calmed with a word, and they said, who is this man that even the wind and the waves obey? The story of the storm in the Sea of Galilee is about Jesus and his sovereignty over nature. It has nothing to do with the metaphorical storms you might be going through. So the David and Goliath thing, who's your Goliath? It always reminds me of that scene in Three Amigos. Maybe their El Guapo is a lack of education. Maybe their El Guapo is something else. Well, in our case, our El Guapo is the actual El Guapo, who's a big man who's coming to kill us. I love that little scene because it so humorously captures the idea of, well, who's your Goliath? Well, no. Goliath was Goliath. He was a giant man who was coming to kill David. The story isn't about the metaphorical Goliath. The story is about God will win the battle, and he did over this. What does it tell you about God? Anyway, so that's one of the major pitfalls of preaching narrative is to take what Joseph and his brothers went through and use it as a metaphor, or the moral of the story is X. And so how can you apply that to your life? Because now then we become moralists instead of letting the gospel transform us. So a different question then, what's the moral of the story that then now can be preached? You should forgive. Okay, well, that's a good moral for the fable, but is that really what the story's about? And a better question to ask is, in a narrative passage, where's the gospel in this passage? Because the story of Joseph is really the story of Jesus. He is a prefiguring of the story of Jesus' forgiveness towards us. And so that passage would have been really easy on Sunday to preach as a forgiveness sermon. And I did reference a lot of the forgiveness teachings in Scripture, and I hopefully I walked that line correctly, because there is implications in here of, boy, are there people in our lives we should forgive? Because Jesus said 70 times 7, and those who are forgiven much love much, and forgive us our sins as we forgive those who have sinned against us. And I mean, that's all in there. That's real. But is the point go out and be better forgivers? Or is the point look how God forgives us in such a different way than Joseph forgave his brothers, or than we tend to forgive one another. Let's go back to the gospel and what does it say about forgiveness? And then we take that knowledge and apply it to whether or not we can forgive well. Because I think a lot of Joseph's story, I look and I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. They need to jump through those hoops if I'm going to really forgive them, because that's how it is for humans. And then I thought, well, why not just preach that? I want to just preach the human element as we read this story, that, yeah, there's something satisfying about a vindication in the process of forgiveness. But am I really the one who gets to be the vindicator? Well, no. But Jesus is, and he says he will be. Okay, so then that gives me help. I'm not really sovereign over their behavior or their feelings of conviction later. I can't control any of that. That makes forgiveness really hard. No wonder it was hard for Joseph. But I do know someone who is sovereign over all things. And at the end, Joseph understood that, yeah, God was moving the pieces, so it helped him forgive. So as I go to the gospel, as I go to the nature and character of God, how does that help me in my ability to forgive? See, that's a very different sermon than Joseph forgave his brothers, you should also forgive. Does that make sense? It's taken me a long time to kind of even be able to parse through those dynamics as a preacher, let alone as a listener or a student of Scripture. But I think it's important. It's important to always go back to God is the main character, not Joseph, certainly not us. Okay, so as we read a story like Joseph and his brothers, or like David and Goliath, the question isn't, what does this mean for me today? That's a good question down the road, but the very first question is, what does this passage tell me about God? What does this passage tell me about Jesus and the plan of redemption in the story of the gospel? Because that's what the book is about. That is the main theme of everything in the book. So even though this family is really messed up, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, they're all scoundrels. They're all messed up. What's the point? Well, I think the point is God picked that family because God's the main character. And what is he doing with this main family? And what does that tell me about how he'll treat me if this is how he treated them? And I think that's where the through line is, not the metaphorical, moral kind of thing. So anyway, preaching narrative, that's some of the stuff that goes in my head. And also this story, writers talk about breaking a story, which is kind of like mentally and organizationally figuring it out. And sometimes breaking a sermon is super easy because the text is just obvious. And other times it's a big fat narrative, and that is difficult to break. And anyway, this is how I chose to break it, which is the brothers and then Joseph's weeping moments, the narrative of the forgiveness and the reconciliation and how hard that was. And what is the deal with the silver chalice in Benjamin's sack? I've never figured that out until this series. And maybe I didn't figure it out correctly, but I gave it my best guess that I really think he put the chalice in Benjamin's sack and then made everybody watch him open it as a test to the brothers to see if they were going to roll over on Benjamin to save their own skins. Because they rolled over on him all those years before. And so just to see this whole favoritism that Jacob had towards the sons of Rachel, which he clearly still is having towards Benjamin, if the other 10 were still bitter and angry and even violent about that, I think this was Joseph's way of saying, what do you do now, boys? You could totally throw Benjamin to the wolves and save your own hides. What are you going to do? I think that makes the most sense of that story to me. But I think it's one of those things that's probably been discussed and debated by rabbis and thinkers and students for millennia. So I'm certainly not thinking that I've solved it for everybody. But the main hook that I wanted in the sermon from Sunday was the 2 Corinthians 5. How does God forgive versus how do we forgive? That seemed to be the thrust that I was going for, that I felt right doing. And 2 Corinthians 5 is he did not count the trespasses against us, but instead put all of that sin onto Christ so that he could put all of Christ's righteousness on us. Again, no strings attached, no hoops attached. So that guy gave me a chance to really roll up my sleeves, literally and metaphorically, and go hard after the doctrine of salvation by grace alone through faith alone, which always will get me a preaching. That'll always get me passionate about preaching because I get so sad, tired of the legalistic tendencies of fundamentalist Christians or the legalistic doctrines of Catholicism or Orthodoxy, which is, oh yeah, we're saved by grace through faith, but that grace is manifested when you do the 4 things that we tell you to do. And if you don't do them, then you're not saved. It's like, well, then it isn't grace through faith. Well, yeah, it is, but then it's also, baptism. It's also the sacraments. Like, well, no. Read Galatians. I mean, the minute you add circumcision back in, you're denying the gospel in total. Well, yeah, but this isn't circumcision. This is different. This is baptism, which replaces circumcision. But it just said that circumcision is external. Anything external is of no value, Jesus says in John 6. The Spirit is what gives life. Yeah, we get all that. But it's also, you have to take communion or it doesn't count. So on a communion week, I really enjoyed digging into that principle of, no. The righteousness of God is a gift. It is entirely a gift. That is what 2 Corinthians 5 is saying. That's what Romans 1:17 is saying, that the righteousness of God is a gift accessed by faith alone from beginning to end. The minute we add anything that says, I did the thing, I'm in the club, you are now violating the gospel. Or like Peter did, and Paul had to call him out for it, is, yeah, okay, you're in, but we're more in because we also do the law. And yeah, Gentiles, you can be saved, but you're not quite the same level as us. And so I'm going to show favoritism to the Jewish Christians over the Gentile Christians. That's what Peter was doing. And when Paul opposed him to his face, which it says in Galatians, he didn't say, Peter, what are you doing? You're violating the rules of Christianity. He didn't say, Peter, what are you doing? You're being kind of racist here, which he was, but that's not what Paul called him out for. What Paul says is, Peter, you are violating the gospel. You're violating the truth of the gospel to which we've all agreed. And he says he did it in front of everybody because it needed to be said. And I have no problem saying that. I think it's Jesus plus nothing. It's Jesus plus nothing. And we can't say that often enough. Our salvation is by God's forgiveness, accessed by faith alone. It is God's grace alone. There is nothing we do to merit his favor. That is the very definition of grace. And how different that is than the way Joseph processed it or the way we naturally want to process it. So I enjoyed kind of going down that path and being passionate and direct about that. So that was last Sunday. We kind of got Joseph and the brothers together again. We have 1 week left in the story of Joseph, and it's actually not really about Joseph this Sunday. It's about Jacob. I think if you're going to study the life of Joseph, which we have, I guess, been doing in this series, you really need the bookends of Jacob. You can't understand Joseph and his brothers until you understand Jacob and his wives and his brother. And the book of Genesis really wraps up with Jacob, not Joseph. After all that Joseph and his brothers go through, the last few chapters of Genesis are really about Jacob. And Jacob comes, he has a face-to-face with Pharaoh. We're going to look at that. He has a face-to-face with all 12 of his boys. We're going to look at that. And just the idea of blessing. The covenant God made with Abraham is that through his descendants, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And blessing is a major component of the patriarchal system. We see it a lot in Genesis. Part of Jacob's tricking of his dad, Isaac, was that he got the blessing that Isaac meant for Esau. We're going to see as Jacob blesses Joseph's 2 boys that there's a weird thing going on there with his arms crossed. And what is that all about? And what does it mean that we now carry on the covenant God made with Abraham as the people of God by faith to say we now are a kingdom of priests with the job of blessing people? Does that just mean being nice to them, or does it mean something else? So we're going to dig into that this Sunday as we wrap up the Genesis series. It's interesting. One of the questions I get asked a lot, or I did when I first got here is, hey, when are you going to preach on Genesis? Are you going to do a series through Genesis? We need to preach through Genesis. And there's a whole ministry out there called Answers in Genesis, and the thesis is that the entire Bible is taught in Genesis. Like you can get the whole Bible out of that one book. I'm okay with that. I think that's true, but then the implication is you should teach Genesis so that our kids can learn the truth about creation and all this kind of stuff, and that the ark was a real historical thing, and I believe all of that for sure. But what I find funny is the people who want me to preach Genesis typically don't want me to preach all 50 chapters, because that would include the Nephilim, angels having children with human women. What do you do with that? It would include Jacob and Tamar, or Judah and Tamar, which we've talked about. It would include Lot and his daughters from, I think it's in the 20s, maybe the teens. There's a lot of messed up stuff there. It's kind of like, you really want me to get up on a Sunday and preach about Onan? I mean, I'm happy to do it. It's in the text. All of Scripture is God-breathed and suitable for teaching. But it's interesting. I think when people say teach Genesis, they mean Genesis 1. So here I've tried to teach, 20% of Genesis? Maybe more than that, 37 to 50 by the time we're done. And there's a lot in there. There's a lot of mess in there. And I didn't shy away from the Judah and Tamar stuff. I didn't shy away from some of the other controversial things in there. Simeon and Levi avenging the rape of their sister Dinah by forcing an entire village to be circumcised. And while they're still in pain, they go run them all through and kill them all. Like, that's in there. So I love the book of Genesis, and I think it's been fun. All this to say, it's been fun for me to get in there and get dirty with it, because the Joseph stuff, it makes for a good musical. But when you realize historically the patriarchal system, the number of moms, the fact that Reuben, the oldest, slept with one of the maidservants, I can't remember off the top of my head if it was Rachel's or Leah's maidservant, who is the mom of a bunch of the other brothers. Like, imagine that meeting when he comes back and he's like, hey, I don't remember whose mom it was. Let's say it was Asher and Dan's mom. Maybe it wasn't, but hey, Asher and Dan, I spent some time with your mom last night. Like, how do you process that? And a lot of times that's not in the Sunday school material, and it just kind of gets brushed aside as, it's another biblical character doing something bad sexually. But it's like, in the family dynamic, think about what he did. And actually, that's one of the reasons he's not going to get the blessing that he thinks he's going to get from Dad in the sermon we're going to cover this week. There's so much in there, and fascinating when you start to connect the dots and think of it outside of just, flannel graph pieces in a Sunday school lesson. So I've enjoyed that. I've really enjoyed being able to communicate that in a way that's hopefully still PG-13 or PG for the kids in the room, but also to kind of help us understand, God doesn't shy away from this kind of thing, nor should we. Like, this is real humanity. And so there's people who have done things like this. Maybe you watching this, you've gone down some of these paths and you're like, God will never forgive me. I'm too much of a mess. And it's like, well, clearly he knew exactly what he was doing. He chose this family knowing they were going to do all this stuff. And the lineage of Jesus himself comes through Tamar, the daughter-in-law that Judah has kids with. I mean, that's part of the story of Jesus. And I think to shy away from that because it's naughty does a real disservice to what God revealed to us. So I appreciate that Grace Church has been so mature as we've handled this. I haven't gotten any emails like, how dare you talk about that? My kids were in the room. Or I think everybody understands this is the beauty of the gospel, is that it is for real humans who do crazy, stupid things and who need the Spirit of God and his power and his presence to be able to live a life that pleases God, because the righteousness of God that's been given to us as a gift is something he produces the fruit of. The goal of ministry is not to make Christians less naughty. The goal of ministry is to help Christians live by the power of the Spirit and bear the fruit that he produces in our life. Does that make us better behaved people? Sure, I guess. But it's the internal as we reflect upon the gospel and everything he's done. And so, that's my ramble and my rant about Joseph, and you won't want to miss the Jacob bookend this Sunday. Tomorrow, Wednesday night, we're back to our classes and such. But of course, the forecast is calling for 70% chance of snow because it's a Wednesday, and we'll just have to deal with that again. But thank you, Debbie, for your comment. Really learning a lot from the Joseph series. Thank you. Thank you. I know I don't get to see you on Sundays, but I think of you often, and I love when you connect with me via email or these kind of notes. You're awesome. And everybody who's watching this, you're awesome. Now, later, never. You are awesome, and you are loved by your Creator, who doesn't count your sins against you, but instead sent his son to bear the penalty of those sins. And so when you meet him face to face, I think it's going to be good if you're able to say, yeah, Jesus took care of my sins, as opposed to, no, I never let Jesus take care of my sins. I'd still like to be responsible for them before you, oh, mighty Creator of all. That's a bad play. So I implore you, be reconciled to God. That's what I'm going to say today. We'll be back Thursday with an update. Have a wonderful rest of your day. See ya.